A hard time until 1965. Once I came out with Papa's Got a Brand New Bag, from there on it was easy. It was almost like coming back home from being away or something like that. I really felt that I'd been there before. I guess my soul has always been there.
What was the first kind of music you were attracted to? Was it gospel music or?
No, the first music I was attracted to was guitar, rhythm and blues. The old blues, Fella playing guitar with a bottleneck around his finger,
Imagine sitting in a room with the most electric human being on the planet. The cameras are rolling. The lights are hot. The interviewer is smiling. Everything looks perfect. And then suddenly, the man they call the Godfather of Soul puts his hands on the table. He looks straight into the camera, and he says something so raw, so honest, so painful that the entire room goes completely silent. Nobody moves, nobody breathes. And then he stands up, and he walks out. Not in anger, not in arrogance, but in a kind of quiet dignity that nobody in that room had ever witnessed before. What happened in that room on that day changed everyone who was present forever. This is that story. Before we dive into video, please subscribe to our channel. The man before the music. To understand what happened in that interview, you first need to understand who James Brown really was. Not the performer, not the legend, not the icon they put on magazine covers and play at halftime shows. The real James Brown, the one who existed before the rhinestones and the capes and the screaming crowds. James Brown was born in 1933 in Barnwell, South Carolina. He came into this world with almost nothing. His mother left when he was very young. His father struggled to keep things together. James grew up in a small shack with no running water, no electricity, and sometimes no food. He was raised partly by an aunt who ran what many people politely called a boarding house. As a child, James watched things that no child should ever have to see. He heard things no child should ever have to hear, and he carried all of that with him every single day of his life. By the time he was a teenager, he was already in trouble with the law. At 16 years old, he was sent to a juvenile detention facility in Georgia. He could have disappeared there. He could have become a statistic, another young black boy swallowed by a system that was designed to keep him down. But something happened inside those walls. James Brown found music, or maybe music found him. Either way, the two of them would never be separated again. When he came out of that facility, he was hungry, not just for food. He was hungry for something that the world had spent his entire life telling him he could never have. He was hungry for respect, for recognition, for a stage where someone would finally look at him and see something worth paying attention to. The rise that nobody expected. The story of James Brown rising to fame is not a gentle story. It is not a slow, comfortable climb. It is a violent, desperate, relentless push against every wall that the music industry and the world tried to put in his way. In the 1950s, the music business was not kind to black artists. They could make the music, but the money that controlled the credit, that almost always went somewhere else. James Brown watched this happen to people around him. He watched talented men and women pour their souls into their art and walk away with almost nothing. And he made a decision very early on that this would not happen to him. He formed a band. He practiced until his fingers bled. He performed in tiny clubs in front of audiences that were sometimes no bigger than a handful of drunk strangers. He drove himself and his bandmates to a level of precision and energy that nobody in that era had ever attempted. His shows were not concerts. They were events. They were experiences. They were something close to religious. By the early 1960s, people were starting to pay attention. By the mid-1960s, James Brown was not just famous. He was a force of nature. Songs like Please Please and Papa Got a Brand New Bag were not just hits. They were cultural moments. They changed the way people heard rhythm. They changed the way people understood what a human body could do on a stage. James Brown invented things on that stage that musicians are still borrowing from 60 years later. But fame did not erase the wounds. Fame never does. It just gives you more expensive things to hide them behind. The interview that changed everything. Now we come to the moment that this story has been building toward. It was the kind of interview that seemed routine on the surface. A television program, a well-known host, comfortable chairs. soft lighting designed to make everyone look relaxed and trustworthy. James Brown walked in wearing something spectacular, as he always did. He sat down. He smiled that enormous smile, and for the first few minutes everything went exactly as these things usually go. The host asked about the music. James talked about the music. The host asked about the tours. James talked about the tours. There was laughter. There was warmth. The cameras captured everything perfectly, and then the host made a mistake. It was not a dramatic mistake. It was not a cruel or deliberate one. It was the kind of mistake that people make when they have read everything about a person but understand nothing about them. The host leaned forward with that comfortable professional smile and asked James Brown about his time in prison. But the way he asked it was wrong. The framing was wrong. The tone was wrong. There was something underneath the question that treated James Brown's pain like a curiosity, like an interesting detail in an otherwise entertaining biography, like something that had happened to a character and a story rather than to a living, breathing human being sitting 3 feet away. James Brown went very still. The people in that room later described what happened to his eyes in that moment. They said the warmth went out of them, not replaced by anger, replaced by something much more serious than anger, replaced by a kind of clarity. He did not raise his voice. That is the thing that everyone who was there remembers most clearly. He did not shout. He did not perform outrage for the camera. He simply began to speak in a voice that was very quiet and very precise and absolutely impossible to look away from. What? Said James Brown looked at the host and he said something close to this. The exact words have been recounted slightly differently by different people who were present, but the meaning has never been disputed. He said that people always wanted to talk about where he came from, like it was the most interesting thing about him. Like the poverty and the prison and the pain were the real story, and everything else, the music and the work and the decades of fighting, were just what happened after the interesting part was over. He said he was tired of sitting in rooms where educated, comfortable people looked at his suffering like it was entertainment. He said he had earned the right to be seen as more than his worst moments. He said that every black man in America who had ever climbed out of something difficult knew exactly what he was talking about, that there was a particular kind of exhaustion that came from having to perform your pain for people who would never understand it, that there was a particular kind of humiliation in being asked to make your trauma digestible for an audience that would go home that night to warm houses and full refrigerators and sleep perfectly. Well, he paused. The room was completely silent. Then he said that he forgave the host, not because what had been done was small, but because carrying that kind of anger would cost him more than it would cost anyone else. He said forgiveness was not something he did for other people. It was something he did for himself, because he had learned a long time ago in a place where the walls were made of concrete, and the nights were very long, that the only thing a man truly owned was what was happening inside his own chest, and he had decided a long time ago that bitterness would not be allowed to live there. Then he stood up, he straightened his jacket, he looked one more time at the camera, and he walked out. The silence after the people in that room did not speak for a long time after James Brown left. The host sat in his chair staring at the space where James Brown had been sitting. The producers behind the cameras did not call cut. The crew did not move. Everyone was processing something that had just happened to them, and none of them quite had the language for it yet. One of the producers, who was present that day later, described it in an interview of his own. He said that in 30 years of working in television, he had never seen anything like it. He said most people who walked out of interviews did it dramatically. They made a scene. They wanted the moment to be remembered as an act of defiance. But James Brown had not done that. He had simply told the truth in a room full of people who were not used to that level of honesty. And then he had left with complete dignity. And somehow that was more powerful than anything the producer had ever witnessed. The footage from that day was handled carefully. Parts of it were aired, parts of it were not. But the people who were in the room carried what they had seen with them. They talked about it. Quietly at first, and then more openly as the years passed, and the story spread the way true stories always spread, not because someone promoted it, but because it contained something real that people recognized when they heard it. What James Brown understood, that most people never learned. James Brown lived another several decades after that interview. He kept performing. He kept pushing. He kept demanding from himself and from everyone around him a standard of excellence that most people found exhausting just to be near. He was not always easy. He was not always gentle. He had edges and complications that people close to him sometimes struggled with. He was a human being with all the contradictions that come with that, but he understood something that very few people in his position ever truly grasp. He understood that the story other people told about you was not your story, that the narrative the world constructed around your pain, your failures, your worst moments, that narrative belonged to them, not to you, and that the most radical thing a person could do was to refuse to live inside someone else's story about who you were. He had come from nothing in a way that most people reading about his life cannot truly imagine. He had been told in 1,000 different ways by 1,000 different voices that he was not worth much. He had been processed by systems designed to confirm that message, and he had decided, somewhere along the way in the middle of all of that he was going to disagree. Not loudly, not always, but consistently, stubbornly, with a kind of faith in himself that had no rational basis at the beginning and yet turned out to be completely correct. What that room teaches yous. The interview that James Brown walked out of is not remembered because of the drama of the exit. It is remembered because of the truth that preceded it. He sat in that chair and he said out loud what millions of people spend their entire lives swallowing in silence. That being reduced to your pain is its own kind of violence. That dignity is not something that is given to you. It is something you claim, even when the cameras are rolling, even when the room is full of powerful people, even when walking away costs you something. He was the Godfather of Soul not just because of what he did with music. He was the Godfather of Soul because he understood something deep and difficult about what it meant to be human. That the soul is not the part of you that performs. It is the part of you that remains when the performance is over, when the lights go down and the crowd goes home, and you are alone with whatever it is you actually are. James Brown walked out of that interview and into history, not because he was angry, because he was free.